few days ago, a message came out. Words, they say, came from Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel. They claim he warned African leaders to stay in line or face consequences, not just to Netanyahu, but to anyone who thinks Africa is theirs to bully. We are not your colony, we are not your pawns, we are sovereign, and we will fight for our freedom with everything we've got.
In July 2025, the United Nations Hall bore witness to an electrifying and unprecedented moment in global discourse. Captain Ibrahim Traore, the interim president of Burkina Faso, delivered what many described as a thunderous final warning to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, a move that resonated powerfully across Africa and the wider world. Traore's words, unflinching and bold, broke through the cautious diplomacy typically expected in international forums. He demanded accountability, justice, and respect, not just for his nation but for the dignity of the entire African continent.
Listen up, because I'm only going to say this once. My name is Ibrahim Traore, President of Burkina Faso, and I'm here to tell you something that's been burning in my heart and in the hearts of millions across Africa. We are done staying silent. We are done bowing down. We are done letting foreign powers treat our continent like their playground. A few days ago, a message came out. Words, they say, came from Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel. They claim he warned African leaders to stay in line or face consequences. Whether he said it or not, I don't care. The message was loud and it was clear. Some people still think they can threaten us, scare us, and control us. Well, I've got a message of my own and I'm speaking it loud and clear, not just to Netanyahu, but to anyone who thinks Africa is theirs to bully. We are not your colony, we are not your pawns, we are sovereign, and we will fight for our freedom with everything we've got.
To truly appreciate the weight of this warning, one must understand the road Traore walked to reach that podium and how his defiance reflects a growing movement of decolonization and assertiveness across his region. By the time Traore stepped into the international spotlight, his country had already experienced a remarkable transformation. Since seizing power, he had charted a course deeply opposed to the neo-colonial structures that many West African nations had long grappled with. In 2023, he made the decisive move of expelling French troops from Burkina Faso, a clear rejection of outside military influence.
People, for our dignity and for our future. And I know I'm not alone. After I spoke, something incredible happened. My words didn't just stay in that room in Ouagadougou. They spread like wildfire. People started sharing the video of my speech on X, Telegram, WhatsApp, everywhere. Within hours, millions of people had seen it. Not just in Burkina Faso, but across Africa and beyond. Young people in Mali, farmers in Niger, students in Guinea, activists in South Africa. They all heard my voice and they felt it. They weren't just listening to me, they were hearing their own hopes, their own anger, their own dreams. In Mali, my brother Colonel Assimi Goïta shared the clip on social media. In Guinea, Mamadi Doumbouya stood up and said he's with me. Across Telegram groups, people started using hashtags like Africa will not bow and we stand with Traoré. Those words weren't just slogans, they were a battle cry. They were a sign that Africa is waking up. We're not just a bunch of countries anymore. We're a family. And when one of us is threatened, we all stand together.
And a symbolic break from a colonial legacy that had lingered long after independence. His administration went further, closing operations of French media outlets, rolling back privatization efforts, and emphasizing local control over strategic industries. Through policies aimed at nationalizing key sectors and building self-reliance, Traore sought to remake Burkina Faso's governance, economy, and identity on new terms. In speeches across Africa, he was blunt in his rejection of exploitation. Colonialism has a new face, he announced. It wears suits and hosts forums, he said, evoking the polished facades of Western institutions that nonetheless perpetuated extraction and dominance. His message was clear. Africa was not a warehouse of raw materials to be used and discarded. These words struck a chord across the continent, where decades of economic manipulation and external interference had bred resentment and resolve. Traore emerged as a symbol of resistance, of unapologetic sovereignty. By July 2025, Traore brought that spirit to the United Nations. At a summit ripe with tension over the escalating crisis in Gaza, he shattered diplomatic restraint with a message both unapologetic and uncompromising. Reportedly, he issued an ultimatum to Netanyahu, demanding a public apology after leaked diplomatic remarks deemed deeply insulting to African nations. He gave Israel's prime minister 72 hours and made it clear the consequences would be swift if the demands were not met. According to accounts of the speech, Traore asserted, 72 hours, or we begin disengaging from every Israeli interest on African soil. These were not mere threats, but rather a declaration of intent, signaling a new era in African diplomacy, one where subordination would no longer be tolerated. His words were not just for Israel. They were for the legacy of colonialism, that insidious power that had long fashioned African states into arenas of foreign competition and exploitation. Global media coverage reflected the shock. Headlines spoke of a moment of reckoning, a turning point that challenged entrenched assumptions about Africa's role on the global stage. On the ground in Dakar and other capitals, the ultimatum ignited protests and visible solidarity among West African publics. Many saw Traore's stand as visceral proof that African states could and would demand respect. But this speech did not emerge in isolation. It was the crowning moment of a trajectory defined by anti-imperialist action, regional cooperation, and visionary leadership. Traore actively promoted the alliance of Sahel states, an anti-imperialist bloc of Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali. He dismantled private ownership in favor of national and collective control. He bolstered agricultural production, distributing tractors, seeds, and resources to uplift rural farmers. Production of staple crops like millet and tomatoes surged. He restructured education and prioritized vocational training and youth engagement to build a homegrown future. Unsurprisingly, Traore's leadership sparked intense commentary. On Reddit, supporters celebrated his consistency and boldness. With words like Ibrahim Traore is so fucking consistent. I love it. Users rallied behind his anti-colonial rhetoric and decisive action. There were also calls for far deeper economic sovereignty. One user reflected Traore's vision directly, questioning how Africa could continue importing rice or tomato paste while being home to fertile fields and rich land, a sentiment echoed by Traore himself in speeches denouncing the mismatch between Africa's potential and its dependency. Of course, not everyone saw things the same way. Some Midwesterner commentators warned of the dangers of authoritarian overreach and the risks of isolating Burkina Faso from global economy and support. Others debated whether rejecting Western ties entirely was feasible or ideologically sound in the long run. But even these criticisms underscored the magnitude of the debate Traore had ignited about sovereignty, systems of power, and histories that still shape modern geopolitics. Because of this, Traore's final warning to Netanyahu did more than just surface tensions between one African leader and one foreign head of state. It reframed a broader dialogue about the shifting balance of power, the assertion of African agency, and what it means to truly decolonize, not just in rhetoric, but in actions that reshape institutions, alliances, and global expectations. The speech echoed beyond diplomatic chambers. Traore's posture symbolized a continent regaining confidence. It raised fundamental questions. Will Africa be treated as equal or only as a resource base? Will global powers learn to heed demands rooted in respect rather than manipulation? Traore's ultimatum whispered another possibility, that power dynamics could pivot, that old hierarchies might be challenged, and that a new chapter in international relations could begin. To critics, Traore might appear too confrontational or provocative. But to his supporters, he articulated a truth long suppressed. He framed sovereignty not as a leftover from colonial era, but as an aspiration real and urgent, meaningful control of borders, resources, policies, and identity. It was a demand for dignity, not dominance, a demand that the world listen.